The happiest day of your life can become the moment you discover who has been quietly waiting for you to fail. He never imagined those words would make sense until the evening I married Emma Collins. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if my older brother Ryan had been planning everything long before anyone sent out the wedding invitations. Our ceremony took place at a restored vineyard just outside Nashville, Tennessee, surrounded by rolling hills, white fences, and rows of grapevines glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. Nearly 150 friends and relatives had gathered to celebrate with us. My grandfather sat proudly in the front row, smiling the same warm smile that had carried our family through decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. My parents looked happier than I had seen them in years. Emma looked breathtaking in a timeless ivory wedding gown, and as we exchanged our vows, I honestly believed nothing could steal that moment from us. Ryan stood beside me as my best man. He smiled in every photograph, laughed with every guest, and shook hands with almost everyone who walked through the reception hall. If someone had asked me that afternoon who I trusted most outside my new wife, I probably would have said my brother without hesitation. That is what makes betrayal so difficult to recognize. It rarely arrives wearing the face of a stranger. The reception began exactly as we had imagined. The band played soft country music while guests enjoyed dinner beneath strings of warm lights hanging across the wooden beams of the old barn. Children laughed on the dance floor, relatives shared stories from years ago, and Emma and I moved from table to table thanking everyone for making the trip. Everything felt effortless. Every detail reflected months of careful planning. After dinner, our wedding coordinator quietly reminded me that it was almost time for the traditional champagne toast. He stepped away for just a minute to greet a few family friends who had arrived later than expected. When I returned toward the head table, something caught my attention that should have meant nothing. Ryan was standing alone beside the row of champagne glasses. At first I assumed he was simply helping the catering staff. Then I noticed him glance over both shoulders before leaning slightly toward one particular glass. His hand moved quickly. So quickly. He could not clearly see what his fingers were doing because another guest briefly crossed between us, but I distinctly saw him pull his hand back and immediately straighten his jacket as though nothing unusual had happened. The moment lasted no more than 2 seconds. By the time I reached the table, Ryan was already smiling again, chatting comfortably with one of my college friends. He noticed me watching him and casually picked up his own glass. "Everything all right?" he asked with an easy grin. He forced a smile of my own. "Just making sure we are on schedule," I answered. He nodded without hesitation and walked toward the center of the reception hall. He looked down at the row of glasses arranged neatly on polished silver trays. They all appeared identical. Crystal flutes filled with sparkling champagne reflected the golden lights hanging above us. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing looked suspicious. I told myself I was probably overthinking a harmless moment. Weddings are chaotic. People reach for glasses, move decorations, adjust table settings, and help staff all the time. Still, an uneasy feeling settled quietly in the back of my mind. Emma slipped her hand into mine and smiled as the master of ceremonies invited everyone to gather for the toast. "Ready," she whispered. He looked into her eyes and pushed every doubt aside. "More than ever," I replied. Together we stepped toward the center of the room while applause filled the hall. My grandfather slowly raised his own glass from the front table. Ryan lifted another with perfect confidence only a few feet away. He reached for the flute waiting in front of me, but just before bringing it to my lips, I noticed something so small that almost anyone else would have missed it, and in that instant I decided I would pretend to drink instead of taking a single sip until I understood exactly what my brother had done. My fingers wrapped around the stem of the champagne flute, but instead of taking a sip, he lifted it only high enough for everyone to believe I was joining the celebration. Around me, crystal glasses caught the warm glow of the string lights while nearly 150 guests smiled and waited for my grandfather to begin his toast. Emma squeezed my hand gently, completely unaware of the questions racing through my mind. He glanced toward Ryan without turning my head too much. He raised his own glass with an expression so relaxed that anyone else would have thought he was simply enjoying his younger brother's wedding. Then I noticed something unusual. His eyes were not on my face. They were fixed on my champagne glass. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to convince me that what I had seen a few moments earlier had not been my imagination. My grandfather cleared his throat, thanked everyone for coming, and spoke about family, commitment, and building a life on honesty. His words filled the room with warmth, yet I could barely focus on them. Every instinct told me to stay calm. If Ryan had truly done something to my drink, confronting him in front of everyone would only create confusion on what was supposed to be the happiest day of Emma's and my life. He gently touched the rim of the glass to my lips without allowing the champagne to enter my mouth. From across the room, Ryan finally relaxed his shoulders. It was almost impossible to notice unless someone had been watching him carefully. That tiny change in his posture made my uneasiness grow even stronger. When the applause ended, guests began talking again, musicians started another song, and servers moved through the reception carrying trays of desserts. He quietly placed my untouched glass onto a nearby table instead of handing it to one of the staff members. A few minutes later, while everyone was distracted by the first dance, I returned to the same table. The glass was still there exactly where I had left it. He picked it up with a clean cocktail napkin instead of touching the bowl directly and carried it toward the wedding coordinator, Melissa. She greeted me with a smile until she noticed the seriousness on my face. He quietly asked if there was somewhere private we could speak for a moment. Inside the small office behind the reception hall, I explained only what I had personally observed. He made it clear that I was not accusing anyone of anything. He simply wanted the glass set aside without being washed or discarded because I believed something unusual might have happened. Melissa listened carefully without interrupting. After several years managing weddings, she had clearly dealt with unexpected situations before. She agreed to place the glass in a secure location and assured me that only she and the catering manager would handle it until we decided what to do next. He thanked her and returned to the celebration before anyone noticed I had been gone for too long. Emma met me near the dance floor with a concerned smile. She asked if everything was all right because I seemed distracted. He hated keeping anything from her, especially on our wedding day, but I also knew I needed more than suspicion before saying a single word. He kissed her forehead and told her I simply felt overwhelmed by the excitement of the evening. She smiled, believing me, and slipped her arm through mine as another song began. Across the room, Ryan laughed with several cousins, looking completely comfortable. Every few minutes, however, I caught him glancing toward the table where my champagne glass had originally been sitting. Each time he looked, his expression tightened for the briefest moment before returning to normal. That repeated glance told me more than any argument ever could. Whatever he expected to happen after the toast had not happened, and for the first time that evening, it seemed my brother was the one beginning to worry. The reception continued as though nothing unusual had happened, yet every smile now seemed to hide a question I could not answer. Emma and I greeted relatives, posed for photographs, and thanked friends who had traveled across the country to celebrate with us. Though everyone else, the evening looked perfect. Only I knew that a quiet thread of doubt had begun weaving itself through every moment. He refused to let it ruin our wedding, but I also refused to ignore what I had seen. Nearly an hour later, Melissa discreetly approached me while the band played another song. She quietly mentioned that the champagne flute had been placed in a secure storage room exactly as I requested and had not been touched by anyone else. Her professionalism gave me a sense of relief. Whatever happened next, at least one important piece of evidence had been preserved. He thanked her and asked that the matter remain completely confidential until after the reception ended. She agreed without hesitation. As I walked back toward the dance floor, I noticed Ryan standing near the dessert table speaking with two of our cousins. A looked relaxed on the surface, but something about his behavior had changed. Earlier in the evening he had moved confidently from group to group, laughing with everyone. Now he kept scanning the room every few minutes, almost as if he were searching for something that had disappeared. When his eyes briefly met mine, he forced another easy smile and lifted his glass in a friendly gesture. He smiled back just as naturally. If he expected me to confront him, I had no intention of giving him that opportunity. Sometimes silence reveals far more than accusations ever can. Later that evening, after Emma and I finished our first dance and the formal photographs with our families, we finally had a few quiet minutes together outside beneath the vineyard lights. She looked at me with gentle concern and admitted she could tell something was weighing on my mind. He took her hands and decided she deserved to know at least part of the truth. He explained exactly what I had personally witnessed without making assumptions or drawing conclusions. He emphasized that I had not actually seen Ryan place any identifiable substance into my drink. He had only seen him make an unusual movement over my glass before watching him repeatedly monitor whether I drank from it. Emma listened carefully without interrupting. Instead of reacting emotionally, she asked one simple question. "Did you drink any of it?" He shook my head. Relief immediately crossed her face. She quietly thanked me for trusting my instincts. Then she suggested we avoid discussing the matter with anyone else until we understood the facts. Her calm response reminded me why I had fallen in love with her. She never rushed toward conclusions. She believed truth deserved patience. As the evening came to an end, guests slowly began leaving with hugs, photographs, and warm wishes for our future together. My grandfather embraced both of us before quietly saying that the strongest marriages were built on honesty even when honesty was difficult. His words stayed with me long after he climbed into my parents' car. Once the last guests had departed, Emma and I returned briefly to collect a few personal belongings before leaving for the hotel. Melissa met us near the entrance carrying a small insulated evidence container instead of the original champagne flute. She explained that one of the catering managers had suggested preserving the contents more securely in case professional testing ever became necessary. Everything had been documented, including the time the glass was removed from service and every person who handled it afterward. He thanked both of them sincerely. Their attention to detail gave me confidence that if something truly had happened, the truth would eventually speak for itself. As Emma and I drove away beneath the quiet Tennessee night sky, I glanced once through the rearview mirror. Ryan was still standing alone outside the reception hall watching our car disappear down the long gravel driveway. A did not wave. A simply stood there with an expression I had never seen before, as though he had just realized the evening had unfolded very differently from the way he expected. The following morning Emma and I woke before sunrise in our hotel suite overlooking the quiet Tennessee countryside. The excitement of the wedding had faded just enough for reality to settle in. We ordered coffee, sat beside the window, and carefully talked through everything that had happened the night before. Neither of us wanted to accuse Ryan without facts. My grandfather had always taught us that suspicion could divide a family just as quickly as dishonesty if it was handled carelessly. We agreed that every decision from this point forward had to be guided by evidence instead of emotion. Before checking out of the hotel, I called Melissa to thank her once again for protecting the champagne sample. She explained that the sealed container remained locked in the venue manager's office and that the chain of custody had been documented from the moment it left the reception floor. She also mentioned something I had not expected. The vineyard maintained high-definition security cameras throughout the reception hall, including one positioned above the bar where the champagne had been prepared before the toast. My heartbeat slowed as I absorbed what she was telling me. He had completely forgotten about the cameras. Melissa said she could not release any footage directly, but the venue manager was willing to meet with us later that afternoon. Emma looked at me quietly after I ended the call. Neither of us smiled because we both understood what the footage might reveal. It could completely clear Ryan, proving that I had misunderstood an innocent moment, or it could answer the question that had been following us since the reception began. By early afternoon we returned to the vineyard. Without the music, flowers, and guests, the reception hall looked surprisingly ordinary. Workers were folding chairs, clearing tables, and packing decorations into storage containers. The celebration that had filled the room only hours earlier now existed only in photographs and memories. Melissa greeted us warmly before introducing us to the venue manager, Daniel Harper, who invited us into a small office overlooking the empty ballroom. He explained that the security recordings were kept for insurance purposes and that he wanted to help while respecting everyone's privacy. He loaded the footage from several camera angles and asked us to describe approximately what time the toast preparations had begun. We watched quietly as the recording played. Guests moved naturally through the room while servers arranged trays of champagne glasses near the head table. Everything appeared completely normal at first. Then Ryan entered the frame. He looked around the room exactly as I remembered. He exchanged a few words with one of the servers before stepping closer to the row of champagne flutes. My breathing slowed as the video continued. From that camera angle his body partially blocked the exact view of my glass, but it clearly showed him reaching toward one specific flute while briefly checking whether anyone was paying attention. Seconds later another guest crossed between him and the camera, hiding the final movement of his hand. When the view cleared again, Ryan had already stepped away and adjusted his suit jacket exactly as I remembered seeing with my own eyes. Daniel paused the recording and replayed the sequence several times. The footage confirmed that my memory had been accurate, yet it still stopped short of revealing precisely what Ryan had done. Emma quietly pointed toward another monitor connected to a different camera. Daniel nodded and explained that the bar area had been recorded from a second angle. He opened the next file while the room fell completely silent. As the recording began, the perspective shifted just enough to expose details the first camera could not capture, and before the crucial moment even arrived, I realized this angle might finally reveal whether my brother had simply rearranged a champagne glass or whether he had done something he believed nobody would ever see. Daniel enlarged the second camera angle until the image filled the monitor. Unlike the first recording, this camera had been mounted almost directly above the service station where the champagne glasses had been arranged before the toast. The perspective was clearer, and every movement around the table could be followed without interruption. Emma reached for my hand as the video began to play. Neither of us spoke. Ryan entered the frame carrying his own champagne flute while exchanging a few casual words with one of the catering attendants. He waited until the attendant stepped away to help another guest before moving closer to the tray that had been prepared for the wedding party. He looked toward the dance floor, then toward the entrance, and finally over his shoulder. The room around us became completely silent. Daniel paused the recording for a moment and quietly pointed toward the lower corner of the screen where the timestamp confirmed the footage had been captured less than 3 minutes before my grandfather's toast. He resumed the video. Ryan slipped one hand inside the inner pocket of his suit jacket and removed a tiny object no larger than the tip of his thumb. The camera resolution was not high enough to identify exactly what it was, but it clearly showed him holding something between 2 fingers before lowering his hand over a single champagne flute. His body blocked the final motion for only an instant. When his hand came back into view, the small object was gone. He calmly straightened his tie, picked up his own glass, and walked away with the same confident smile he had worn throughout the evening. Nobody else appeared to notice anything unusual. Daniel stopped the recording and slowly leaned back in his chair. I cannot tell you what he placed into the glass, he said carefully. But I can confirm that this video accurately reflects what happened in front of that camera. Emma let out a slow breath. He continued watching the frozen image of Ryan standing beside the tray, wishing there were some innocent explanation I had simply failed to imagine. He had spent my entire life believing my older brother would protect me if anyone ever tried to hurt me. Instead, I now found myself trying to understand why he had secretly approached my drink on the most important day of my life. Daniel explained that another piece of information might also prove helpful. Every member of the catering staff had signed in before the reception, including the bartenders and beverage attendants assigned to the champagne service. If necessary, each person could confirm where they had been standing during the preparation for the toast. Melissa added that one bartender specifically remembered replacing a single champagne flute after another guest accidentally brushed against the tray earlier that evening. She could not remember whether that replacement occurred before or after Ryan approached the table, but she believed the timing would be documented in the service log. Every new detail seemed to build another piece of the same puzzle. Nothing alone answered every question, yet together they formed a picture that became harder to ignore. Before leaving the vineyard, Daniel handed me copies of the security footage along with the official preservation records documenting how the recordings had been stored since the wedding. Everything had been carefully logged with dates, times, and signatures. Emma thanked everyone sincerely for treating the situation with professionalism instead of speculation. As we walked toward the parking lot, she quietly reminded me that we still did not know Ryan's motive or what had actually been placed into the glass. She was right. The video proved suspicious behavior, not intent. Later that afternoon my telephone rang. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar local laboratory that specialized in beverage analysis. Melissa had arranged for the preserved champagne sample to be delivered there earlier that morning. The technician introduced herself politely and explained that the initial screening had been completed. She said the sample contained an unexpected substance that should not have been present in champagne served at a wedding reception, and she recommended discussing the complete findings in person rather than over the telephone. Emma and I drove to the laboratory early the next morning carrying more questions than expectations. The facility occupied a quiet office park on the edge of Nashville, and everything about it felt calm, organized, and professional. A technician named Dr. Claire Whitmore welcomed us into a small conference room before placing a sealed report on the table. She explained that the preliminary screening had been completed using standard laboratory procedures and that the sample remained intact should additional testing ever become necessary. Before opening the report, she carefully reminded us that laboratory results identify substances, not motives. That distinction mattered. He appreciated the way she separated facts from assumptions because I had promised myself from the beginning that I would never accuse my brother without evidence. Dr. Whitmore slid the report toward us and explained that the champagne contained a concentrated amount of an over-the-counter sleep aid that had been dissolved into the drink. She emphasized that the ingredient was legally available and commonly sold to help people sleep, but it absolutely did not belong in a beverage being served during a wedding celebration. Combined with alcohol, she explained, the substance could cause significant drowsiness, slowed reaction time, impaired coordination, and confusion in many healthy adults depending upon individual sensitivity. She also made something else very clear. The quantity detected was inconsistent with accidental contamination. It had been intentionally introduced into the drink at some point before the toast. He stared at the report for several long moments without speaking. Emma quietly reached across the table and rested her hand over mine. Neither of us reacted with anger. Instead, we both felt the same heavy disappointment. The laboratory had not answered why someone would do such a thing, but it had confirmed that my instincts on the wedding day had probably protected me from a situation that could have ruined the evening or placed me in an embarrassing and vulnerable condition in front of everyone we loved. Dr. Whitmore asked whether we wanted copies of the laboratory findings. I nodded, and she prepared certified copies together with documentation describing the testing procedures and the chain of custody from the moment the sample arrived. Every page carried dates, signatures, and reference numbers. The professionalism reminded me of the security footage. Piece by piece, independent sources were telling the same story without anyone needing to exaggerate a single detail. As we walked back toward the parking lot, Emma quietly asked the question that had been sitting between us since the reception. What could Ryan possibly have hoped would happen? He thought about it for a long time before answering. If I had unknowingly consumed the drink, I might have appeared unusually tired, confused, or unsteady during the speeches and celebration. Guests could easily have assumed I had consumed too much alcohol. My wedding photographs, conversations, and memories of the evening might all have been overshadowed by something nobody could explain. The realization left me with a deeper sadness than anger. These had never been about physical charm. It seemed designed to steal dignity from one of the happiest days of my life. As we drove home, I began thinking back over the previous several months. Small moments that once seemed unimportant slowly returned to me. Ryan had repeatedly joked that marriage would change me. He often asked whether I was absolutely certain I wanted such a large wedding. He even suggested more than once that expensive celebrations usually ended in disappointment. At the time I dismissed those comments as ordinary teasing between brothers. Now they sounded different. They formed a quiet pattern that I had completely overlooked. Later that evening my father called to ask whether Emma and I had settled into married life. He almost told him everything, but I stopped myself. The evidence was becoming stronger, yet I still wanted Ryan to have an opportunity to explain his own actions before anyone else reached conclusions. He simply told my father that there were a few important family matters we hoped to discuss together soon. After ending the call, I organized the security footage, laboratory report, and written notes into a single folder before placing it inside my desk. Emma looked at the growing collection of documents and quietly said something I knew was true. "The evidence is almost complete," she whispered. "Now the only missing piece is the truth that only Ryan can give us himself." 2 evenings later my parents invited Ryan, Emma, and me to dinner at their home just outside Franklin. Nothing about the invitation suggested confrontation. My father simply said it had been too long since the entire family had shared a meal together. Emma and I exchanged a quiet glance after ending the call. We both understood this might be the right opportunity to ask questions, but we also agreed that the conversation had to remain respectful. The purpose was not to accuse Ryan in front of everyone. It was to give him every reasonable chance to explain the evidence that had steadily accumulated over the previous 48 hours. Before leaving the house, I placed the security footage, laboratory report, and written timeline into a simple leather folder. I hoped I would never need to open it. Deep down I still wanted there to be an explanation I had failed to consider. When we arrived, everything felt comfortingly familiar. My mother had prepared roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, and homemade rolls exactly the way she had for countless Sunday dinners throughout my childhood. Ryan greeted us with an easy smile and congratulated us again on the wedding as though nothing unusual had happened. If he felt nervous, he hid it remarkably well. Throughout dinner the conversation stayed light. My grandfather joked about learning how to use a new smartphone, my father discussed a fishing trip he hoped to take later that summer, and Emma shared stories from our honeymoon plans. Ryan laughed at the right moments and carried on naturally with everyone around the table. Watching him, I almost questioned everything all over again. It seemed impossible that the same brother who had helped me learn to ride a bicycle and stood beside me during difficult moments growing up could also be the person shown on those security recordings. After dessert, my mother began clearing plates, but I quietly offered to help. While we stood together in the kitchen, she noticed the expression on my face and gently asked whether something was wrong. I told her there were a few family matters I hoped we could discuss before the evening ended. She looked concerned but nodded without pressing for details. Once everyone returned to the living room, I placed the leather folder on the coffee table. The room immediately became quieter. Ryan glanced briefly at the folder before looking back toward me. He spoke calmly and explained everything exactly as it had happened from the beginning. I described seeing him approach my champagne glass, choosing not to drink from it, preserving the sample, reviewing the security footage, and receiving the laboratory results. He never raised my voice. He never accused him of intending harm. He simply described verified facts in the order they occurred. When I finished, I opened the folder and placed the certified laboratory report beside printed still images captured from the security recording. My father studied the papers without saying a word. My mother looked from the documents to Ryan with growing concern. My grandfather remained completely silent, his hands folded together as though carefully weighing every detail. Ryan finally leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Instead of denying that he had approached the champagne tray, he admitted that the man in the video was clearly him. A also acknowledged placing something into the glass. The room seemed to stop moving. My mother quietly covered her mouth while my father stared across the room in disbelief. Ryan quickly insisted that he had never intended to seriously harm anyone. A explained that the substance was only a common sleep aid and claimed he believed it would simply make me appear tired enough to cut the reception short. A said he never expected anyone to preserve the drink or review security footage. Then, for the first time that evening, he lowered his eyes and admitted the one thing none of us had expected to hear. A confessed that he had become consumed by jealousy for months because he believed my life had always come more easily than his, and watching everyone celebrate my happiness on our wedding day had pushed him toward a decision he now deeply regretted. No one spoke for what felt like an entire minute after Ryan finished. The silence carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. My father remained seated with his hands resting on his knees, staring at the floor as though he were trying to understand how two sons raised in the same home had arrived at such different choices. My mother quietly wiped away tears, not because anyone had shouted, but because she had just heard one child admit betraying another on the very day our family had gathered to celebrate love. My grandfather finally broke the silence. His voice remained steady, carrying the quiet authority that had guided our family for decades. He looked directly at Ryan and said that jealousy could explain a decision, but it could never excuse it. He reminded all of us that every family experiences moments when one person's life seems to move faster than another's, yet character is measured by how we respond to someone else's success, not by how we compare it to our own disappointments. Ryan lowered his head even further. For the first time since the conversation began, there was no defensiveness left in his expression. A admitted that watching everyone congratulate me throughout the engagement had gradually convinced him that I had become the center of the family while his own struggles went unnoticed. Instead of asking for help, he allowed resentment to grow quietly until it shaped his judgment. A confessed that he believed making me appear confused or exhausted during the reception would embarrass me enough to overshadow the celebration. A never imagined I would notice his actions, preserve the glass, or patiently gather evidence instead of reacting immediately. Hearing those words answered the final question that had followed me since my wedding. The motive had never been money. It had never been inheritance. It had simply been envy that had remained hidden for far too long. Emma gently squeezed my hand beneath the coffee table, reminding me without speaking that I still had a choice about what happened next. He looked at my brother for several moments before answering. He told him that what hurt most was not the laboratory report or the security footage. Those were only pieces of evidence. The deepest wound came from realizing that someone I trusted enough to stand beside me as my best man had secretly hoped to take away a joyful memory that could never be recreated. Weddings happen once. No apology could ever return the moment he had tried to steal. Ryan nodded slowly and accepted every word without argument. He quietly apologized to Emma for involving her wedding day in something she never deserved. Then he apologized to our parents for forcing them to witness a conversation no family ever wants to have. Finally he looked at me and admitted that forgiveness was something he had no right to expect. My father stood and walked across the room before placing a hand on Ryan's shoulder. He did not defend him or minimize what had happened. Instead he calmly said that accountability begins when excuses end. If Ryan truly wanted to rebuild trust, his actions over the coming months would matter far more than anything he said that evening. My grandfather agreed. It reminded us that trust is rebuilt one honest decision at a time. Before leaving, I closed the leather folder and placed every document back inside. He told everyone I had no intention of humiliating Ryan or carrying bitterness into my marriage. The evidence had accomplished its purpose. It revealed the truth without anger, without shouting, and without forcing anyone to choose sides. However, I also explained that rebuilding a relationship required healthy boundaries. Until trust could be earned again, Emma and I would be creating some distance. Ryan quietly accepted the decision without protest. As Emma and I walked toward the front door, my grandfather stopped me for a brief moment. He smiled gently and said something I would remember for the rest of my life. It told me that protecting your peace is never the same as abandoning your family. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to allow dishonesty to become normal. Those words stayed with me all the way home, and for the first time since my wedding day, I felt that the truth had finally replaced uncertainty. 6 months passed more quickly than I expected. Autumn slowly replaced the warm summer evenings that surrounded our wedding, and life settled into the quiet rhythm Emma and I had hoped for when we first exchanged our vows. We bought our first dining room table together, planted flowers outside our small home, and discovered that the happiest moments of marriage were often the ordinary ones. Morning coffee before work, evening walks through the neighborhood, and peaceful weekends spent building a future together became far more meaningful than any grand celebration. Every now and then I would think about the events of our wedding day, but those memories no longer carried the same weight. They had become reminders of how important it is to trust both your instincts and your principles. During those months Ryan respected the boundaries we had established. He never appeared unexpectedly at our home, never pressured anyone to forgive him, and never tried to explain away what he had admitted. Instead, he quietly began repairing relationships one conversation at a time. My parents occasionally told me that he had started meeting with a counselor and volunteering at a local community organization. They never asked me to change my decision. They simply shared what they observed, allowing me to reach my own conclusions. My grandfather often reminded me that genuine change is measured by consistency rather than promises. He remembered those words every time someone mentioned Ryan. Later one Saturday afternoon my grandfather invited the entire family to his home for an early Thanksgiving dinner. Emma looked at me before we accepted the invitation, silently asking whether I felt ready. He smiled and told her I was not returning because everything had been forgotten. He was returning because healing sometimes requires showing up after the truth has already been spoken. When we arrived, the atmosphere felt different from the last family gathering. There was no tension hiding beneath polite conversation. Ryan greeted us respectfully, thanked us for coming, and returned to helping my grandfather arrange extra chairs on the back patio. He did not force a conversation or ask for immediate forgiveness. His quiet respect spoke louder than any apology could have. During dinner my grandfather asked each family member to share one lesson they had learned during the past year. When my turn came, I looked around the table before answering. He said I had learned that trust is one of the few things in life that cannot be replaced once broken, yet honesty is the first step toward rebuilding it. He also said that protecting your peace does not require hatred. Sometimes it simply requires wisdom, paciencia, and the courage to establish healthy boundaries. Everyone listened quietly. Ryan nodded without looking away. After dinner he asked if we could walk together for a few minutes through the backyard where we had spent countless childhood afternoons playing baseball. We stopped beneath the old oak tree our grandfather planted decades earlier. Ryan apologized once again, but this time he did not ask me to forgive him. He only said he hoped that one day his future actions would become stronger than his worst decision. He looked at him for a long moment before answering. He told him forgiveness had never been the difficult part. Rebuilding trust would simply take time, and that was something neither of us could rush. He accepted that answer with quiet understanding. As Emma and I drove home beneath the clear Tennessee sky, I realized our wedding day had not ultimately been defined by betrayal. It had been defined by the choices that followed. Choosing patience over panic had preserved the truth. Choosing evidence over accusation had protected our family from unnecessary division. Choosing boundaries over bitterness had protected our marriage. Looking back now, I no longer remember that day as the moment someone tried to take away my happiness. I remember it as the day I discovered that real strength is not found in revenge or anger. It is found in remaining calm when your heart is tested, standing firmly beside the truth even when it hurts, and believing that dignity will always outlast deception. That lesson became the greatest wedding gift Emma and I could have carried into the rest of our lives.